They had already fixed the noose on the wooden scaffold in the red dust autumn market. A thin woman, clutching her worn coat tightly to her chest, stood as still as a shadow. Among the crowd that turned away, only one man quietly stepped forward and placed in her hand a small, still warm crumb of bread. From that moment on, no one in town ever looked at her the same way again. Part 1. The breadcrumb in the coat pocket. In the dim light of early morning, Margaret Hale eased shut the tin door whose hinges had long come loose, as if afraid the sound might wake the children curled under thin blankets inside. Her hand slid deep into the pocket of her old coat, where a breadcrumb lay wrapped in a crumpled piece of cloth. Her fingers touched it as one might touch something fragile, then quickly withdrew, keeping it warm. The sky still held the ashy blue of night, but the morning wind already carried the dry scent of earth, mingled with damp straw and the stale smoke of an old hearth. From the bare lot behind the row of shingled houses, gusts came sweeping in, lifting fine dust into a thin veil that drifted at eye level. Margaret breathed deeply, letting the wind fill her chest, but felt no relief. Only a raw sting. She hadn't eaten dinner the night before, not from fullness, but because the habit had set in so long she couldn't remember when she'd last eaten until she was full. The crumb of bread she kept had been saved from the evening before last, broken off from the hard loaf she'd been given, secretly tucked away, not to ward off her own hunger to the point of fainting, but for her youngest child, the boy too small to speak, yet already used to sucking his fingers to sleep. Margaret bent to pick up a rusty can by the door. Another gust slapped her patched skirt against her legs. Every stitch in that skirt was a night spent by the dim flame of a lamp, sewing for the children more than for herself. Out here, people looked at women like her, with a glance that slid away, as though poverty were a sickness caught by meeting someone's gaze. She raised her eyes toward the distant mountains. Thin mist clung to their peaks, catching a silver light so beautiful it could swallow all the cramped thoughts of those living below. But for Margaret, the mountains were not beauty, they were a wall. They stood between her and everything: opportunity, safety, a wind-tight roof. Inside the shack came the soft rustle of children turning in their sleep, then stillness. They knew mornings were when their mother went out and came back with something, a crumb of bread, a few potatoes, or just a bit of clean water. Never once had she eaten in front of them first. That was the only gift she could give, the feeling that their mother always knew how to keep them fed, even if it was a lie. She pulled her thin scarf tighter, stepping onto the stony ground. Each step crunched against the earth in time with the cold wind, threading through every gap in her clothes. Her hand stayed in her pocket, guarding the crumb as if it were the last spark left in her life. Some nights, when the wind slipped in through the cracks in the tin roof, Margaret imagined placing that crumb in someone's hand, a person kind enough to ask, "Are you all right?" But by morning there was only dust, wind, and the children's dry cough for an answer. Today, as always, she would keep the crumb until the sun was high, until her own hunger dulled beside her child's hollow eyes. And when she placed it in his tiny hand, she would turn away, so he wouldn't see her bite her lip in shame at having nothing more to give. She walked on, feeling the weight and the lightness of someone who knew she had nothing except a breadcrumb and a reason to keep it. Part 2. A wish small enough to mock. Morning in town always began with the rattle of wagon wheels over the hard-packed dirt road, but to Margaret the sound was not bustle or promise. It was a reminder, almost mocking, that the wagons laden with goods would never stop where she stood. She tightened her scarf and sat on the sagging wooden step outside her tilting shack. Before her, the town looked like a faded painting. shop signs with peeling paint, the scent of baking bread mingled with the leathery smell from the cobblers, and thin smoke from someone's kitchen drifting upward into the morning. People called this the best hour of the day. She only saw it as the hour that showed most clearly the gulf between having and not having. In her pocket, yesterday's breadcrumb was still there. She had meant to save it for noon, but that morning the baby woke with cracked lips and a look that seemed to ask why his mother hadn't fed him. She broke it in half, giving him one piece and keeping the other for herself. The bread was dry and cold on her tongue, but she swallowed it quickly so he wouldn't see that she was hungry too. If anyone asked her dream, it wasn't for a fine house or a new dress. She wished for a roof that didn't leak wind, a table big enough for 6 bowls, and a morning where the children could eat until they were full before running out to play, instead of curling up, waiting for her to bring something home. But such small wishes, when spoken aloud, became a joke. Here people called that naive, because no one had time to dream on an empty stomach. Once, while standing in line for church charity, Margaret overheard 2 women behind her talking about her. They didn't lower their voices. What's she got besides all those kids? Probably just hoping some man'll take her to have fewer mouths to feed. The words clung to her like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Ever since, when she passed strangers, she felt herself shrink, as if every glance could see the lack she carried. The town moved on as it pleased, no one pausing to ask what Margaret thought. Sometimes a coin rolled to her feet from someone passing by without a glance, like tossing alms into an empty tin. She bent to pick it up, feeling gratitude and humiliation at once. On some nights when the wind howled through the door, she held the children close and wondered if she was truly raising them or just keeping them alive until someone else decided their fate. Still, despite the scorn and the sidelong looks, she kept one image hidden in her heart. The children gathered around a table, hands on spoons, eyes bright. She didn't dare call it a dream, only a picture to carry her through hunger. That ridiculous little wish was the one thing still tying her to life. This morning, as she tied her scarf and led the children toward the autumn market, she expected nothing to change. The market was where people came to trade, and where women like her learned exactly where they stood. But sometimes, even a lifelong bowed down doesn't know the moment when someone will lift it, just enough to meet another person's eyes. Part 3. Autumn Market Morning. The road to the autumn market stretched out under the soft light of early day. The wind in the night had swept away yesterday's dust, leaving darker streaks of earth stamped with the prints of hooves and wagon wheels. Margaret walked slowly, each step weighted by the pull of 5 children trailing behind her. Each wore a patchwork of mended clothes, the fabric dulled into the same gray tones as the road. None of the children spoke. They were used to mornings like this, when their mother led them to the market not to buy, but to see if anything had fallen or been tossed aside. Margaret didn't need to remind them. The eldest already knew to take the youngest by the hand, because in this season the wind could carry away a cry, and no one in the crowd would turn back. The market lay in the center of the square, where wooden buildings huddled together as if bracing for the coming winter. Smoke from food stalls curled upward, carrying the rich smell of hot fat mingled with the sweetness of ripe apples from the fruit stand. The familiar sounds rose, fabric sellers calling out, coins clinking from one hand to another, chickens squawking in wicker baskets. Margaret passed it all without stopping. She didn't want to linger at any stall. The seller's eyes would quickly read the truth, that she had no money. Sometimes she spotted crumbs on the ground, broken, dust-covered, and the smallest would start to bend down. She would pull the child's hand gently but firmly, saying nothing, the pressure enough for them to understand. In the thickest part of the crowd, buyers and sellers jostled together. Everyone was busy with their own wares, and in that busyness, Margaret could almost disappear. But she knew if anyone looked closely, they would see a woman too thin, with a coat torn at the shoulder, eyes that never lifted fully. The children, though hungry, kept their pace. They had learned from her how not to let longing show. From time to time they glanced at the bread stalls or candy stands with quiet eyes, then turned away as if they hadn't seen them. The sun began to slant across the rooftops, lighting the red, yellow, and blue painted signs. For others, this was the sign of a good trading season ahead. For Margaret, it only sharpened the sense that she stood outside of it all. Near the end of the market row, a group of men clustered outside the saloon, their laughter and the smell of liquor spilling into the street. She steered the children in a wide arc to avoid their eyes. Here, women like her were not only looked down on, they were easily turned into someone's sport. She knew too well the half-joking, half-cruel remarks that would follow if she hesitated at the door. As they passed, the sharp chime of the clock outside the repair shop rang out. The sound, steady, impersonal, made her realize that here everything had value, except the people no one wanted to buy. The autumn market bustled on, full of color and sound. But to Margaret it was a great mirror reflecting the emptiness in her hands. And this morning, like every other, she only wished to pass through quickly, to get the children home before hunger made them forget how to keep silent. Part 4. The Loaf She Couldn't Pay For. Margaret stopped before a small bakery stall in the corner of the market. From it came the scent of freshly baked bread, warm flour mingled with butter, and the faint caramel of browned sugar. The world around her seemed to slow. The market's noise faded into a dull backdrop, and only that smell held her and the children in place. On the wooden shelf lay round loaves, golden-crusted, dusted with white flour. They looked like small suns, warm enough to make a shivering child hold their breath just to look. The youngest tugged at her skirt, eyes wide. Margaret knew the child wouldn't speak, but in that gaze lay a hunger more urgent than the wind. She stepped closer. The seller, a woman in her middle years, was counting change for another customer, brisk hands brushing crumbs from the shelf. Margaret stood at the edge of the counter, quietly waiting as if only to take a better look. 1 loaf. She knew the price, and she knew exactly how many coins she had, far from enough. But the heat and scent before her made such calculations blur. Her hand slipped into her pocket, feeling the cold, hard coins. Too few, yet all she had. The woman turned to her, eyes moving from Margaret's face to the children behind her. The look held no malice but no warmth either. It was the look of someone used to people like her, coming to ask the price, then walking away. Margaret swallowed, pointing to the smallest loaf. The woman named the price. Margaret heard every word, and it felt as if the whole market had gone quiet, just so she could hear how much she lacked. A pause. Her hand drew back, ready to thank her and leave. But at that moment the youngest child reached out and touched the edge of the shelf, a fingertip catching on a dusting of flour. The seller's brow furrowed slightly, and Margaret bent quickly to pull the child away. She couldn't say why, but in that instant she decided. It wasn't reason, it was hunger, overrunning shame. Her hand shot forward faster than she meant, and closed around the loaf. Before she could think, she had pressed it into the child's hands. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the seller's sharp call cut through the stillness, and heads began to turn. Margaret felt the heat flood her face. She meant to give the bread back, but the child's small hands had already locked around it. He didn't know what had just happened, only that the sweet, warm smell was now within reach. Margaret stood in the center of the gathering stairs, curious, scornful, a few tinged with distant pity. Here theft, even of a single loaf, was enough to drag a person into the square for judgment. And Margaret knew the price of this reckless act might far outweigh any coin. But when she looked down and saw the crumbs spilling from between her child's fingers, she wasn't sure she would choose differently, even if she could go back. Part 5, the wooden platform and the rope. Afternoon slid over the town like a heavy blanket, dulling what the morning had made sharp. Sunlight retreated from the eaves, leaving long shadows from the porch posts, stretching across the square like strokes of dark ink. In the center stood a newly built wooden platform, dark with fresh pine resin, its scent mingling with road dust and kitchen smoke. Above it, the rope hung in a loose loop, swaying faintly in the dry wind like a cuff meant for the neck of someone the town had already named that morning. Margaret was pushed forward, her wrists bound with coarse hemp, stray fibers scratching deep enough to leave straight red lines like chalk marks. She didn't look around, just focused on keeping her balance as she climbed the steps. Each board groaned under the worn soles of her boots, a dry, hollow sound like an answer no one needed to give. At the makeshift railing, the children were held back by 2 guards. They stood on tiptoe, gripping the wood, eyes wide and searching for their mother through the crowd. The youngest didn't understand, only beat a small hand against the chest of the man carrying him, his hoarse cries falling to the ground and breaking like dust. On the platform the air was different, sharper, carrying the smell of damp hemp and faintly the rust of the iron hook. The hangman stood beside her, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms thick and sun-browned, black boots polished. He neither asked nor barked orders, just checked the loop, tightened the rope once, and waited. His work was habit now, steady as the bellows in a blacksmith shop, up, down, never missing a beat. Below, townsfolk ringed the square. They had come from the forge, the bakery, the northern row of houses. Some still wore aprons dusted with flour or soot. No one jostled, no one left. Each face was like a half-shut window, seeing without taking in, present but unwilling to be called a witness. The thick silence was broken only by the rattle of an empty barrel, rolling from an alley before settling still. Margaret stood straight, the way a mother might when trying to leave her children an image with as little damage as possible. Sweat gathered at her temples, but her hands were cold as iron. The rope brushed her cheek when the wind shifted. Against her neck's thin skin, she smelled the fiber, musty, bitter, almost nauseating, as though every insult she'd endured had been braided into it and now laid across her throat. She thought of last night's missed supper, of the breadcrumb in her pocket that morning, of her children's small hands on the way through the market. Nothing could pull her from this place except the eyes watching from beyond the railing. Those eyes didn't accuse, didn't even understand. They only waited for one of those rare good things that sometimes appeared in grown-up stories to help children fall asleep. A crow landed on a power pole, tilting its head. Its wings stirred a thin haze of dust below, making a few cough. The church bell at the far end of the street gave a single flat strike, unclear if it marked the hour or echoed the cold metal of the afternoon. The wind gathered again, cross-cutting the square and lifting a few hairs at the back of Margaret's neck. The hangman lifted the noose slowly, almost as if asking an invisible permission. He slipped it over her head, adjusted it into place. The hemp's stray fibers burned against her skin. Margaret swallowed, her larynx pressed into the rope as if a small stone had lodged there. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, not to pray, but to keep the tears from falling where her children could see. From the railing, the eldest shook his head, as if that could push back what was coming. Another pressed both hands to his mouth, holding his breath until his face blanched. The market warden nearby glanced over her like a merchant inspecting stock. Meets the requirements, clear enough. Fit to make an example. Above, the sky was neither bluer nor grayer, just flat and cold like a sheet of tin. Margaret opened her eyes, glancing across the platform's worn center, where countless feet had crossed to leave this world. Names, reasons, lives, those were forgotten. Only the even where in the wood remained. The thought passed as quickly as a speck of dust, but left a weight of iron in her chest. The hangman placed one hand on the release lever, testing its grip, the other steady on the rope. Everything was ready. A long wind cut through the square, blowing scraps of paper to stick along the steps, like letters never sent. Margaret drew breath deep into her lungs. No one offered a last word. No one said they were sorry. Here, law was kept by things you could hold: wood, rope, post. The shame of a woman weighed nothing in others' hands, but was heavy as lead when placed around her own neck. She didn't beg. She held her spine straight, so that if the children had to carry this last image, it would be of a figure standing, not bowed. And just as the hangman's fingers shifted the lever by a knuckle's breadth, the entire square seemed to hold its breath for the sound that would close the day. From the far edge of the crowd, a step broke from the shade of the porch, boot heels slow and sure, like a nail driven true into the grain. The wind turned, the rope stilled, suspended between two possibilities. No one knew what would come next, only that the silence then was thick enough to break in one's hand. Part 6. The Eyes That Looked Away. When the boot steps reached the wood, the square did not change color, but something inside it deepened into quiet. The man emerged from the eastern porch, out of the long shadow of the town hall, a dark ink stain across the earth. The last light of the day trailed after him, catching the thin layer of dust clinging to the hem of his long, brown coat. A wide-brimmed hat shaded half his face, leaving only the set of his jaw and a gaze that was steady, unhurried. Margaret heard the sound but didn't turn her head. The noose was still on her neck, tightening faintly as she breathed, reminding her nothing was over. Her eyes stayed on her children, holding to an invisible cord between them. As the man drew closer, the crowd shifted aside, not out of respect nor out of fear, but for something stranger. They avoided his eyes. Each person found somewhere else to look: the roofline, a nail in the pole, the tips of their own boots. Anything but the newcomer's face. It spread like wind over dry grass, light but covering everything, making the quiet heavier than before. The baker, standing nearest the rail, bent to fuss with the tie of his apron. The blacksmith rested an elbow on his knee, rolling a small hammer in his palm as if testing its weight. An old woman in a black scarf drew her granddaughter closer, whispering something that made the child turn away. No one wanted to be witness to this moment, because it might force them to choose a side. The man, Elias Monroe, didn't glance at the crowd. His steps led straight to the platform, to where the rope hung, to where Margaret stood as if fused to her own shadow. He stopped at the foot of the steps, looking up. No words, no nod, but the gaze, steady, plain, without judgment, was like coarse cloth wrapped over a wound, not asking where it came from. Margaret had not been looked at like that in years, not since her husband died. The eyes she knew were those of sellers weighing each coin, of market wardens tallying each loaf, of passers-by glancing through her as though she were a cracked, unsellable thing. This gaze did not measure, did not appraise. It only confirmed that she existed in this moment, in this light. A strong gust turned the rope half a circle, brushing her hair. Dust rose from the square, veiling the space between them for a heartbeat. When it cleared, Elias still stood there, one hand resting lightly on the post, unbothered by the hemp or the glances skittering away around him. In the crowd, a few shifted their stance. A cough or two filled the gap. But no one spoke. This was not the stillness that waits for an ending. It was the pause before someone changes the course of a river. Margaret felt a faint current run the length of her spine. Not wind, not fear, but something unfamiliar, as if someone had just placed in her palm something she had forgotten existed. The belief that there was at least one person who would not turn away. Above, the crow still perched on the pole, but silent now. Below, Elias's shadow stretched up the steps, touching the toes of her worn boots. And for the first time since morning, Margaret blinked slowly, as though to keep this image before anything else could take it away. Part 7. The Quiet Man. At the edge of the square, beneath the porch where the afternoon shadow pooled like a dark ink stain, a man stood still, both hands holding his wide-brimmed hat against his chest. Elias Monroe, owner of a horse ranch a mile outside town, was tall and broad-shouldered, a fine dust clinging to his trouser legs, like the long track of days spent in the fields. He neither pushed forward nor hid himself in the back. He stood exactly where the wind could pass over him without changing course. On the wooden platform, the woman kept her spine straight, her hair tangled against the dry rope. Behind the railing, her children craned up on their toes to find her. Elias looked at them as one might look through a long closed window, not at something new, but something old that had just been wiped clear. His throat was as dry as an early summer road. He took a short breath. The smell of hemp and pine sap mingled with the faint scent of scorched grass. From the stockyard, south of town, his house had a porch wide enough for 3 people to sit without their knees touching. The dining table had 6 chairs, but for years only one had been pulled out. Upstairs, a small bedroom window stayed half open, the white curtain aged by sun and wind, moving faintly on nights when no one was awake. The 3rd winter after burying his wife, Elias had driven another nail into the porch beam, simply because in heavy winds the roof groaned like a sob. Since then the roof was quiet, but inside the house there were still silences, deep enough to hear a cricket pause between 2 notes. His wife used to sit on the steps, hands folded in her lap, listening to the seasons pass without leaving any news. Once, when the doctor visited on a low-cloud day, he looked at them for a long time and then laid down words as gently as a leaf on a table. Nothing more to be done. From that day their meals grew shorter, the sound of spoon against bowl softened, as if they feared breaking something already cracked. When she died, Elias buried her under the rise behind the house, near the young pine he'd planted, their first year in the territory. The pine had grown, its shade stretching to the porch, but nothing inside the house had grown with it. On the platform, the woman bowed only slightly, just enough to breathe past the rope. The youngest cried so hoarsely the sound caught in his throat. Elias saw the slight tremor in her bound wrists and felt the plain, stinging truth. Some women were born to tend a poor hearth. They knew how to split a loaf already too small, how to shield against the wind with their own bodies. Some things should be paid for with coin or labor, but there were acts that, if paid for with a noose, would leave the town in debt to itself for a very long time. The wind pushed past the porch, carrying a single blunt church bell strike. Elias looked down at his hands, old calluses from rains, scratches from mending stalls, the thin cut from a knife that slipped while shaping a latch. They were hands used to keeping things upright, a newly broken colt, a warped plank, a roof about to lift, but keeping a person from judgment. He couldn't recall ever doing that. Since his wife's death, the town had flowed past his life like water, gentle but cold. He worked much, spoke little. People said, "Elias is the sort of man who's just good enough." He hadn't bothered to disagree. Mornings he lit the fire, fed the horses, packed the timber. Evenings he checked the fence line. At night he sat at the table, listening to the porch roof stay quiet. The crickets change hiding places. Days like that, strung together so tightly, he thought they might go on forever, needing no one inside them, only someone to stand watch. Now, standing here, he understood there were things you could not simply stand and watch. The way she kept her back straight on that platform reminded him of his wife, smoothing the broken edge of a hairpin, to make it less ugly instead of throwing it away. The same way, mending what could be mended, bracing what could be braced. No loud words. No words at all. The crowd shifted feet. A few coughed to remind themselves they were present. Across the square, a saloon boy pushed the door. The rusted hinge moaned like a rope dragging across wood. Elias looked up. The rope around the woman's neck turned slightly in the wind, the loop tightening just enough to deepen its mark on her skin. Her face held no plea, only the stubborn light of someone who'd lived long with shame, but kept one small corner of dignity, looking her children in the eye. He tucked the hat under his arm and smoothed its brim. A habit from the days he decided to buy an old horse, simply because it stood patiently. His boot heels tapped twice on the boards, splitting the silence in his head. His thumb rubbed the stitched seam of his trousers where an old tear had been mended. Perhaps since his wife's passing, this was the first time he saw it so clearly. Silence, if left too long, was just another way of siding with the wrong. Elias glanced over his shoulder toward the dusty road leading to the ranch. Along it, the pines he'd planted darkened in the evening, their shade reaching the porch. That shade wasn't enough to cover the absence inside, but it was enough to tell him the house still had space. Space with the latch already drawn back, waiting for someone to pass without knocking. He breathed in, deep enough to catch the scent of baking bread from the stall nearby. His hand closed on the brim just enough to make the leather creak. Then he stepped out from the porch shadow. Each step was even, unhurried, like pacing the ground between two fence posts. He didn't think of law or of gossip. He thought of something simpler. If no one put a hand to a thing worth touching, his long table at home would forever seat only one, and this square would always be the place where people learned to turn away. The platform loomed ahead, the rope above. Wind puffed his coat, then let it fall. The ground beneath his boots was as firm and flat as long-seasoned planks. Elias stopped at the foot of the steps. His eyes lifted, meeting the woman's. There was no bargain in them, no plea, only the quiet recognition that from here, someone would have to speak for those who hadn't yet dared to. He nodded once, a movement only he understood, then placed his hat over his heart. In the distance, the church bell struck again, short and sharp. Above, the crow stretched its neck and fell silent. And in the stillness, enough to hear the wind change, Elias had made his decision. In the next part of the day, his voice would be the only one that needed to rise. Part 8. Stepping out of line. The wind swept sideways across the square, dragging a thin ribbon of dust over the platform steps before letting it dissolve like smoke. The sun sank lower, catching on the porch edge and sliding down the newly cut boards, their grain showing light and dark like a healed wound. Above, the rope loop turned half a circle, grazing Margaret's tangled hair. She kept her back straight, eyes fixed on the railing where her children clung, 10 pale knuckles locked white from holding too long. At the eastern edge, the man under the porch, Elias Monroe, no longer stood still. He lifted his hat from his chest, tucked it into the crook of his arm, and stepped from the shadow. Dust fell from his worn boots with each step, leaving a clear trail on the hard-packed ground. He did not hurry, nor did he move slowly enough to turn it into a spectacle. He walked as if the space between himself and the platform were the old path from his house to the horse stalls, measured over years by the rhythm of his breathing. The crowd shifted faintly, a ripple without sound. Some edged half a foot aside, some pulled their hands from pockets, others bent suddenly to fix a bootlace. No one blocked him, no one wanted to look as if they were making way. The avoidance was like the smell of cold ash, there clinging to clothes but denied by everyone. Elias stopped at the base of the steps. On the platform the hangman already had a hand on the lever. The muscles in his forearm stood out under tanned skin. The market warden stood off to one side, coat stiff, eyes hard as driven nails. From the railing came the ragged breaths of the children, threading with the faint rustle of the crowd into a quiet backdrop. Elias spoke, not loudly, not tightly, like a man saying something ordinary. "Let her go with me." 4 words landed on the boards without breaking, without echo, settling like a stone into the hollow of a palm. The hangman paused, his fingers loosening on the lever by a knuckle's width. Heads turned, but no one answered. Across the square the saloon door rocked in the wind, then closed. The hinge gave a thin cry like thread pulling through coarse cloth. Elias kept his gaze on the rope, as if the thing to be bargained with was not the crowd, nor the law, but the object itself. "I'll pay her debt," he added, same tone, steady, sure, without pleading. "In horses, in timber, in a full season's work, but hanging a mother, that's a debt this town will carry." The air shifted into a different kind of quiet. A few eyes dropped. Not in belief, not in fear, but because the words had landed in the very place each had tried to avoid. The hangman drew his hand back from the lever, straightened. The rope stopped turning. Above, the crow changed its perch from wire to post, tilting its head as if to watch longer. Margaret heard every word, as clearly as water seeping into dry soil. The loop still touched her skin, but something had shifted, not its position, but its weight. She didn't turn her head, only drew a longer breath so it no longer snagged halfway up her throat. The market warden moved half a step as if to speak, then let it go. The law here usually came with a shout or a gun stock. Today it meant something just as native to this land, a rancher's pledge, the kind that bound a man's hand to his word. Behind Elias, a few men laced their fingers together, remembering an old wager in which he'd traded his own goods to settle another's loss without waiting for thanks. Elias set his hat on the first step, his other hand resting on the edge of the plank, not climbing, not retreating. He stood exactly where a decision could tip either way. His eyes met the hangman's, not demanding, not commanding, but offering the simplest way to set aside an expensive mistake. Let the rope fall. The pause lasted long enough for the jingle of harness rings from the horse trading yard to carry down the street. Then the hangman's hand, the one used to gripping hard, loosened. The loop slid from Margaret's neck, dropping slowly like a ring too large for the finger of someone who'd grown thin. No one clapped. No cheer rose. Only a small sound as her knees touched the boards, and the wind's shift sending the dust toward the reed-choked flats beyond town. Elias held out his hand, sun-browned, thick with a thin scar at the base of the thumb. It waited there, not pulling, not pressing. Margaret saw it through lashes gritted with dust. She let a beat pass, long enough to recognize she was no longer being pushed, but invited to rise. Then she placed her hand in his, the pressure closing slowly, just enough. No one said thank you. No one said let's go. But as the children by the railing began to cry softly, the sound like wind over a bottle's mouth, the crowd began to break apart, shadows stretching long across the dirt. The rope still hung there, swaying in the habit of something not yet discarded. But in the middle of the square, something else had shifted. Instead of seeing a woman measured like merchandise, the town had to watch one hand take another. And from where she stood, Margaret, silent still, felt the weight lift from her neck, and for the first time in months, her steps knew the slope that led downward. Part 9. The rope falls. The rasp of the rope sliding off the beam sounded like a long breath held since morning, now finally released. The coarse loop slipped from Margaret's neck, dropping to the boards and leaving behind a raw red welt, as if a strip of fire had passed there. Air widened suddenly around her throat, but in her chest, the breath still came hard, like trying to pass through a door stuck in its frame. She stood still a heartbeat longer than anyone expected. When her knees gave way, she sank slowly, hitting the platform with a dry, hollow thud. It wasn't loud, but enough to make a few at the outer ring shift their weight. Dust lifted, clinging to her hem and to the red mark at her neck, making it stand out sharper in the slant of the late-day light. No one rushed forward, no cheer, no pat on the shoulder. The silence of the town only changed shade, from the stillness of waiting to the stillness of discomfort, then thinned away like smoke. At the railing, the children eased their white-knuckled grips. Still they stood on tiptoe, eyes unblinking, as if afraid to look away and miss what had just happened. A shadow blocked the glare in front of Margaret. Elias had stepped onto the first board, standing at the edge, hat tucked in his left arm, right hand extended, palm up, knuckles roughened by years of rains. The hand was neither urgent nor hesitant. It waited, steady as a barn door he closed each night, there, holding until the right touch came. Margaret looked up. Through the dust, his gaze was clear. Not pity, not curiosity, but a rare steadiness, acceptance without condition. She regarded that hand the way a lost traveler regards a mossed stone pointing the way. Then she set her own into it. The grip was just enough to bring her upright, slow and sure. His hand was warm, not from the sun, but from long habit of steadying things that might tip. A skittish colt, a warped plank, a roof losing shingles. When she stood, the late-coming dizziness swayed her. Elias leaned just enough for her to rest against the post, withdrawing his hand at the exact moment it was no longer needed. No words. The hangman stepped back, laying the rope aside like a tool out of place. At the square's edge, a door shut softly, its hinge a thin underline. The crowd had already begun to thin. Boots turning, coat hems sweeping dust, heads lowering, not in greeting, but in farewell to something they had seen enough of. Margaret touched her neck. The welt was coarse, stinging like cold metal under her fingers. She lowered her hand slowly, leaving the faint impression of thin fingers on the skin. She glanced toward the railing. The eldest had let go of the slats, shoulders falling as if giving weight back to his frame. The baby in the guard's arms had gone silent, eyes wide, not with fear but with wonder at the space where the rope no longer was. Elias made a small sign with his chin. The market warden, the one who had gripped Margaret's wrist that morning, hesitated, then slid the latch. The bolt scraped in the quiet like another rope being undone. The children squeezed through the gap, not running but stepping fast, eyes fixed on their mother. They stopped at the foot of the platform. The smallest reached out, hand open, but didn't touch. Margaret bent down off the step, head tilting from the faintness, one hand on the board edge. This time Elias didn't steady her. He stepped back half a pace, leaving room for the space between mother and children to close by itself. When the first fingertip of a child brushed her skirt, she exhaled, a full breath, the first real one since morning. The slow-burning shame was still there, heavy as road dust yet to be washed, but in its center something small and warm was drying. The feeling of being seen, of being touched, of rising with the help of a hand that asked nothing about the debt. It had no name yet, but it was enough to loosen her spine, enough to keep her chin from dodging the sun. Elias picked up his hat, settled it on his head, his eyes sweeping the square briefly, like a herdsman checking the gate, before moving the stock. Few were still looking. The many always leave quickly after the hard part is over, leaving the ground with overlapping boot prints and the rope's shadow swinging useless across the planks. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of water from the well up the street and of green apples crushed under someone's heel. Margaret tightened her hold on the children. The welt at her throat no longer stung sharply but pulsed with a steady warmth like mild sunburn. She lifted her eyes, not high, just enough to see the sky, no lower than before, enough to know it still had room for another afternoon. Elias stood half-turned, shielding the children from the wind. A sparrow landed on the wire, shaking droplets left from last night's rain down onto the porch roof. The drops hit the wood, breaking into small, dark freckles, quiet, persistent, unnamed. There was no ceremony, no new verdict, only a woman rising from the boards, a man withdrawing his hand at the right moment, and 5 children pressing into her, as roots press into soil regained. From here, the dusty road down to the edge of town was the same, but their steps, leaving the square, carried a different weight. And in the last strip of sunlight sliding across the platform, the rope lay still, a nameless object again among pine resin and dust, exactly where it belonged from now on. Part 10, 6 shadows on the road home. The square behind them dissolved like thin smoke. The murmurs, the slamming doors, the blacksmith's hammer, tapping the afternoon's rhythm, all dropped away, fading as if forgotten at a bend. Ahead, the packed dirt road stretched south in a brown ribbon between stands of wind-bleached reeds. Elias led them to a rough cart tied at the watchpost. The gray horse drew in a deep breath, blowing a thin mist from its nostrils like a greeting to a short journey. He checked the reins, tested the wheel pin with a firm shove, the practiced motions of a man who did everything without noise. Margaret lifted the baby. The other 4 climbed into the bed of the cart, knees drawn up by instinct learned from more sitting than standing. The cart rolled forward, wood creaking on the axle, a loose nail ringing faintly, leather straps rubbing, the horse's hooves drumming steady as an old lullaby. Beyond the last houses, the wind lost its smoke smell, turning to hay and earth newly stirred by wheels. Dust rose low, wrapping her hem, then falling back to leave a grainy trace on the skin. Margaret set the baby against her, her free hand drifting to the welt on her neck. The skin still burned, but her breath now traveled the full circuit in her chest without catching. She leaned to one side so the children could settle together, a crooked line like the teeth of a saw, each kept quiet in their own way. The eldest stared straight down the road, the second counted the wheel's rhythm, the next worried a loose thread at the cuff, another traced invisible circles on the cart's plank. Words weren't needed. They read in each other that this was a time for listening. Up front, Elias loosened the reins now and then, letting the horse slow to a walk over the rougher ground. He didn't turn around, only leaned once to tuck a coarse blanket against the cart wall to block the draft. A small act, like laying a brick in a cracked wall, unthanked, but sure to hold the night. They passed the village well, the wooden bucket tilting, the water bright and still, holding a sky already one shade darker. From the corn stubble a flock of crows burst up, scattering like a ripped black cloth. Farther on, a road sign with one broken corner pointed toward Cedar Lane, the slope to Elias's ranch. The children began to slacken. The baby dozed, head nodding to the wheel's cadence. One sibling bent their knees into a pillow, curling an arm around the baby's neck, a thin circle that looked too frail to hold, but kept away the smallest startles. Margaret watched them, her throat tightening with the sense of finding something dropped long ago. the sight of children asleep on a moving ride, trusting the space between a mother's heart and a horse's ears to be safe. Elias passed back a tin water flask. No words, just a sure handoff, then back to the reins. Margaret took it, pressing the cool metal into the eldest's hand. The water passed once through 5 mouths, returning lighter but enough. The road dipped, flanked now by young cedars and pines. The wind here carried sap's resinous promise, strong, straight, needing no speech. The sun touched the ridge, stretching the cart's shadow ahead, turning the 6 of them into a single wavering shape leading itself home. A rut jolted the front wheel. The cart shifted as one. Margaret laid her palm on the backs of the 2 middle children, steadying them. Her thumb brushed over the ridge of a thin shoulder blade, closer to ache than to comfort. When the cart leveled, they looked up without smiling or crying, just meeting her eyes for a moment before dropping them again. It was enough to say they were still here, and the one holding them was still holding on. They forded a narrow creek, water licking the spokes, freckling their clothes. The horse snorted, head dipping, mane dampened in one streak. Elias leaned forward, stroking its neck with the back of his hand, the same measure he had given her on the platform, just enough to let the one crossing know it wasn't alone in the deeper place. Cedar Lane rose ahead, a smooth slope like the back of a great animal dotted with young pines. Above, one last square of sky hung unclaimed by evening. Against it, the outline of a house filled the space, still gray-roofed, chimney dark as an unspoken word. Margaret didn't stare. Her head was heavy, her eyelids pulled by weariness and quiet relief. But the porch line, the doorway, the fence drew in, gentle as pencil marks on coarse paper. The cart slowed on sparse gravel. Stone rolled under the iron rim with a sound like a spoon against a wooden bowl. The wind shifted, carrying not fire's warmth, but the warmth of a place already holding someone's breath. Margaret looked back. The road from town had thinned to a thread, draped over low mounds before vanishing into pale dust. At its far end, the square remained, with the rope lying on the boards and the townsfolk already at their suppers. The old shame still clung, like dust not yet shaken off, but inside, something had righted itself, setting her shoulders square under the thin scarf. Elias drew the reins. The horse stopped. He didn't turn to ask, didn't signal. He simply sat a beat, letting the road they'd come fall away from them. In that pause, the grasshoppers in the verge all sprang at once, their wings brushing into a soft, thin chorus. The children sat up straight by instinct, eyes fixed on the house's shadow spilling across the yard. The cart rolled again slower, the way a person steps onto a porch at dusk. No one said, "We're here." The words felt too big for a night this tired. But in the corner of Margaret's sight, the sky had stopped drawing in. It opened a small gap of light, just wide enough to gather all 6 shadows inside. And as the wheels crossed the faint line between road and yard, her breathing matched the hoofbeats. Not fast, not slow. Just steady enough to know she was still here to take another step. Part 11. The house with room to spare. The horse stopped before a flat stretch of ground where a timber house stood in the late afternoon light, as if it had been waiting there a long time for someone to return. Its shingled roof was silvered with age, deep grooves cut like the lines of a face that didn't smile often but had never collapsed. The chimney was silent, yet in the air lingered the faint scent of old ash, the kind that once came from nights with a hot meal and the clink of spoons against bowls. Elias stepped down first. His boots touched the earth with a dry thud before he rounded to the back of the cart and held out a hand as if it were a habit, requiring no invitation. Margaret didn't take it at once. She set her foot down, skirt catching on the cart's side, and freed it gently. His hand remained open, unhurried. At last she touched it, the rough warmth on his palm lifting her from the bed of the cart. The children came down in a line, small feet pressing into gravelly earth that crunched like biting through corn husk. They huddled close, eyes fixed on the unfamiliar roof, holding a mix of caution and want. No one asked where this was. Such questions belonged to those who believed they had the right to choose whether to stay or go. The front door opened with a long hinge cry. Inside, the last light of day slid through a low window frame, washing over plank walls with gaps between old wooden chairs and a long table with 6 intact seats. A thin coat of dust lay across the tabletop, except for a bright circle polished daily by the bottom of a drinking glass. Elias set a canvas sack in the kitchen corner, near an old black stove and a neat stack of split firewood. He lit the fire with quick, practiced motions. A thin ribbon of smoke curled and vanished into the chimney, the room's smell shifting at once from must to the sharp, warm bite of burning pine. Margaret stood in the doorway, arms full of the baby, but eyes moving over every corner. The space was larger than anywhere they had slept in months. The walls were not smooth, not pretty, but sounder than what she had called a house before. An open stretch of floor ran from the window to the stove, wide enough for children to run if they remembered how. Supper was set out in rough, unceremonious fashion. A pot of stewed beans in the center, dark bread cut into thick hunks. Elias pulled out a chair and sat without gesture or urging, as though the room itself was roomy enough for each to choose a place, the food enough so no one need rush. The children hesitated, then hunger pulled them in. Margaret took the seat nearest the stove so the baby could catch its warmth. She broke a piece of bread for the child before dipping her own spoon into the beans. The metal touched the pot with a small, solid sound. Metal against something sturdier than itself, but not breaking it. Outside, the wind still swept the fields, but here it came only as a thin draft through the door seam, just enough to stir the tablecloth's edge. Firelight licked over the children's faces, replacing the flat black in their eyes with a reflection of warm gold. Margaret reached for more bread and noticed its heft. The crumb was soft and close, without the gaping holes of underproofed dough, without the sour tang of flour kept too long. She bit into it, feeling something in her chest unfasten. Lightened by an unseen hand, the meal went slowly. No one spoke much, but no one looked at them as if at goods for trade. Here they were, simply people eating to see another day. The children emptied their bowls, leaned back in their chairs, eyes unfocused but no longer tight. Margaret's gaze moved over the walls, the door frame, the stove. She knew this wasn't her home. But in the way Elias set another chair near the stove, in the way he cut the bread into even shares as though this table had always been meant for 6, she understood. This house had room, not just to sleep, but to breathe like human beings. When the fire sank, Elias added a log, left the table without waiting for thanks. Margaret watched him, spoon still in hand, and heard in the crackle of pine a kind of acceptance, not spoken but enough for her to know. Tonight, none of them would sleep outdoors. Outside, darkness settled slow over the roof. Inside, the warmth lingered longer than expected, as if it knew to stay until the new arrivals had time to believe it was truly theirs, for now. Part 12. A night without the wind coming through night came cautiously, as though afraid to spill the bowl of soup, still steaming on the table. Wind scraped the pine trunks in the field, but by the time it reached this roof, it was only a thin, spent breath, like someone who had stopped being angry. On the stove, the fire pulled into a red core, ash folding over it like a light blanket. Each time the wood cracked, the sound rose to wake an old memory before dying again. Elias carried a kerosene lamp to the north window, where the hinge groaned with every push of wind. He set the lamp on the sill, left hand steadying the frame, right hand turning the screwdriver, each turn sinking sure into wood. The hinge quieted with each bite of the screw until only the lamp's oil could be heard simmering. He opened and closed it twice, listening like a doctor at a patient's chest, then stepped back. Across the room, Margaret sat on an old rug by the stove, the baby's head in her lap, breathing evenly. A basket of patchwork scraps lay beside her. Thread slid through the eye of a curved needle as she mended the worn elbow of her eldest's shirt. Needle in, out, to the fire's breath. Now and then she glanced up, following the thread of smoke out of the stove before bending again, unwilling to miss a stitch. The other four lay on blankets spread before the hearth, turned toward its heat like cats finding, sun patch. One child hooked toes into the heel of another, as if to be sure this wasn't a dream. All five were quiet, no calling for their mother in sleep, no flinching at wind through the roof. Silence like that might be common in other houses. Here it was new. Elias drew the curtain higher, straightened the latch bar in the frame. He moved along the wall, past the low cupboard, stopping at the front door. Another place where wind seeped by day. He knelt, stuffed an old burlap strip into the gap, tapped in a wedge with the hammer, face unchanged as though closing a private debt. Each tap of the hammer matched one of Margaret's stitches. Between them a bridge was built from work no one had asked for. On the table the dishes stood inverted, water beading on them like cheap glass drops. Margaret rose to wash them in warm water from a tin basin, making no hasty clatter. Each bowl was stacked straight, its rim dried with the corner of her skirt. The rope mark at her neck had faded to the pale brown of cinnamon bark. Her fingers touched it once, then let go, as if testing how much of the hurt still lingered. Elias turned down the lamp wick until the flame was small and yolk-colored. He pulled a chair close to the stove, near the wood box so more fuel could be added without delay. Seated, he tested a set of small knives used for whittling pegs, letting their worn edges skim his fingertips. Cold, weighted, like words kept few but enough. No one asked, "How long will we stay?" That question was as big as the shadow of the pine outside, sweeping across the window when the wind shifted. Tonight they let it stand outside. They kept inside what was needed. Steady fire, held warmth, the smell of black bread still in the grain of the table, the children's even breathing. Margaret hung the mended shirts near the stove to dry, the patches shining darker than the cloth like the under eye of someone after illness. She folded an old kerchief, set it by the youngest, and pulled the blanket to the child's chest, not against drafts from the roof, but simply for surety. She sat again, arms around her legs, thumb rubbing the edge of coarse fabric, eyes on the coals. Her shoulders eased down a notch. Elias went to snuff the corner lamp, leaving only the one by the stove. Outside, the dark was thick as ink. He opened the door a crack, looked out at the porch. The sky was dusted with stars, their silver tangled with cold air. He shut it quickly to keep the warmth in, straightened the kettle lid so it wouldn't rattle, added a small split of wood, enough to keep the fire until morning's first unbroken sleep for these children. The room settled. Even the old chair that always groaned when pulled stayed quiet tonight. It felt like a place that had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Margaret tilted her head, cheek to the baby's hair. Smoke and old milk mingled in a smell so familiar. Her eyes stung. She didn't cry, only drew another slow breath to fix it in memory. A night without the wind coming through. Elias fetched a thick blanket from the cupboard and dropped it over the back of her chair. No hand to her shoulder, no question. It landed with a soft thud against the floorboards. She pulled it over her knees, gave a nod too small to name, and went on watching the fire. By the time the kitchen clock's hour hand moved another notch, the fire had burned down to neat red coals. The children slept deep, their breathing sometimes breaking into a sound like small waves against grass. Elias spread his own blanket by the door, back to the wall, hand close to the stove's poker, as in his solitary habit of guarding a house by ear. The night passed through the room like someone in soft shoes. No one counted the wind's turns, or the hammer blows that had held the roof, or the stitches closing a sleeve. They only knew that tonight they had added a few more things. Burlap in a door seam, screws biting into wood, bowls set safe to dry, a sleep that did not require clutching the blanket against the wind. Before she closed her eyes, Margaret lifted her head, firelight warming her pupils to the color of honey. Her hands clasped her knees, back leaning lightly to the chair. The pain at her neck was fading to memory. She didn't know what tomorrow would be, but here, in this small, still moment, she felt a plain uprightness returning to her body, as if her spine had uncurled, as if a window had stopped its rattle. One night without the wind coming through was enough to relearn how to sit quietly, breathe deep, and trust the fire would wait for morning. Part 13. Morning Lessons in Saddling a Horse. That morning dawn came unhurried, as if it wanted to linger over the sight of blue smoke, curling around the roof of the wooden house. Early light spread a silver band across the porch, then slipped through the door's crack, still damp with dew. A rooster crowed from afar, blending with the sound of wooden wheels grinding over dry earth somewhere down the road. In the kitchen, the fire had been coaxed back from last night's embers, a thin but steady flame, just enough to boil a large kettle of water. Elias stepped into the yard early, carrying 2 old leather saddles. He set them on the rail of the horse pen and began checking each strap. His calloused hands didn't just know how to hold a hammer, they knew how to soften a rein by running it through his fingers, as if speaking to it in a language that made no sound. The scent of old leather mixed with the warm smell of horse and fresh sunlight, a smell that couldn't be bought, only earned when man and animal had been together long enough. Margaret came onto the porch, holding the wool scarf of her youngest. She wasn't used to looking straight into the morning. Her eyes stayed low, as if afraid the light might reveal the days behind her. But today, something made her pause. The children, for the first time in weeks, weren't jostling for spots by the hearth. They poured into the yard, their steps cautious at first, but when they saw Elias kneel by the gray horse to adjust the tack, all 5 moved closer. Elias told no one what to do. He simply removed the saddle, placed it in the hands of the eldest boy, then turned to gently lower the stirrup for the second child to try. The children watched him closely, as if every motion, turning a buckle, threading the strap, were a small piece of magic. Each time a knot was tied right, they looked at each other, then at their mother, waiting for some sign they'd done well. Margaret stood a few paces away, fingers laced together. She knew that in town some would laugh at a poor widow letting her children touch saddle and reins instead of needles or brooms. Where she had lived before, horses belonged to men, and women were only near them to carry water or sweep the stalls. But Elias thought differently. He handed the children the tack as he might hand them a spoon, to hold, to try, and to figure out for themselves. The youngest clung to Margaret's leg, eyes fixed on Elias's broad hand resting on the horse's neck, stroking along the mane. The horse shivered slightly, then stood still. The eldest boy imitated the gesture, his small hand sliding over the smooth coat, awkward at first, but growing steadier. A shaft of sunlight fell right there, catching Margaret's eyes. She blinked and for the first time in months, her lips were not pressed tight in shame. Elias passed a small knife to the third child, handle first. He said nothing, but the way he offered it, the quiet waiting, the refusal to snatch it back, made Margaret realize he was giving them something she had never dared to think of, the right to act, to err, and to try again. The light clop of hooves sounded as they circled the pen. The gray horse shook its head, its mane tossing a streak of light. The children gave a soft laugh, not the carefree burst of the untroubled, but the cautious smile of something learning to stand, like a sapling just past winter. Margaret sat on the steps, picking loose threads from the scarf, but her eyes stayed on Elias and the children. When the saddles were secured, Elias stepped back. He didn't praise them or pat their shoulders. He simply wiped his hands on his trousers and tightened his own belt, as if a necessary task had been done. Instead of running off, the children lingered by the horse, touching the stirrup, the leather as if trying to memorize the feel of this morning. Margaret realized some things didn't need words. A rein, a knot, could teach a person to stand straighter, not to show strength, but to keep balance when the wind rose. She drew a deep breath, her shoulders no longer pulled in. In the morning light, her face lifted for longer than before, and when the second child ran over to press a loose strap into her hand, she took it without looking down. In this land, people usually lowered their heads only when digging graves or asking forgiveness. But this morning, Margaret found she could lift hers, not because someone had pardoned her, but because someone had quietly given her back a place to stand. And sometimes that was worth more than bread in a season of hunger. Part 14. The paper in her pocket. Noon settled like a fine dust. In the kitchen, sunlight filtered through the thin curtain, laying square patches of light across the darkened wood table. The kettle on the stove breathed out white steam, rolling into the corners before fading, leaving behind the faint scent of burning pine. After the morning saddling lesson, the children were still in the yard, one tracing lines in the dirt, one crawling under the porch to count shavings, another gathering dry leaves as if collecting the last bright pieces of the day. Margaret washed the smell of leather from her hands and stepped toward the tin water jug on the table. Beside it lay a small paper, blown askew by the wind, one corner curled up. The pencil marks were thick and clumsy, the letters leaning like they might topple. "We're not hungry anymore." Below the line, a drawing, 4 round heads and a single long arm wrapping around them, too long for the bodies, the way children measure fullness. She stood still for a long time. On her neck, the rope's mark from yesterday had faded, now like a faint thread of smoke passing by. Her work-worn fingertips pressed the rough paper, feeling the raised grain of pencil as if touching her own spine. Outside, the wind passed over the porch with a soft rustle, but in the kitchen, everything seemed to pause to make space for this short sentence, written with the solemnity only children could give. Margaret sat down, placing the paper in her left palm, folding her right hand over it with the care she once gave the rare letters she sent but never received back. The paper was small and thin, but heavier than most loads she'd carried. It weighed as much as a full midday meal, as much as a roof that no longer let the wind in, as much as the saddle strap the children had tightened themselves that morning. It weighed as much as the right to believe that tonight, when they lay down, they would not dream of bread falling from their hands. The back door creaked. Elias came in, arms dusty with wood shavings, smelling faintly of fresh pine resin. He paused at the threshold, eyes sweeping over the stove, the blanket folded near the hearth, and finally resting on the paper in her hands. Neither spoke. He only stepped to the water barrel, lifted the lid, and poured a few ladles into the jug, so quietly that the water's sound was like a cloth wrung out before hanging. Margaret folded the paper into quarters, the creases straight as the seam she had sewn yesterday on the elbow of a coat. She didn't put it away yet. She pressed it to her chest for a moment, then slid it into her pocket, the place long reserved for things that had to survive many days. The paper touched the thin lining, and in that spot she felt a layer of warmth. The children clustered at the doorway like sparrows. The eldest sniffed, hiding a half-formed smile. The middle one held up a scrap of rope cut by Elias that morning, showing it like a talisman. They didn't ask if their mother was happy. They didn't need praise. The words on that paper were reward enough. A badge worn over the heart, visible only to this house. Margaret stood and poured water into the tin cups, handing them to each child in turn. When she reached the last, the jug was nearly empty. Elias topped it up without a break in the flow. The sound of water filling quickly eased an invisible emptiness that had lingered in the kitchen's corner. On the table lay a scrap of bread from lunch beside a knife scarred in the shape of a half-moon. Margaret broke it in two, the larger piece onto a dented tin plate, the smaller kept back. Not from habit of going without, but as a way to remember. Today was different. The paper in her pocket seemed to press lightly against her back, making her posture naturally straighter. The afternoon light softened, gentle as a damp cloth on a fevered brow. Margaret carried the basin to the porch, washing dishes in the dry, whispering wind. The children retied the knots they had learned that morning. The saddle rested on the rail like a tamed creature. Elias fixed another wooden latch to the west window, the snug click sounding as right as a solved riddle. When she finished, she wiped her hands on her apron and stood for a moment, looking at the distant fields. Young cypresses nodded lightly, the sky dipping low on the horizon, where the road from town was no thicker than a thread of black. She touched the small square in her pocket, hearing her own breath. Steady now, not halting like when she'd crossed the gate in the early mornings. Inside, the fire had dwindled to small coals, the scent of ash gentle as a day's last story. Margaret stepped in, hung the wool scarf over a chair back, set the last tin cup in its place on the table. She squared her shoulders, smoothed her apron, and lifted her head, not high, not in defiance, just enough so her neck no longer carried the memory of a rope. The paper lay quiet in her pocket. It didn't demand, didn't promise, but opened a way to remain, to set each small thing in order, to divide each share fairly, to keep the fire just enough through the night. Outside, the shadows of 6 figures lengthened and then drew in as the sun sank behind the rise. At the line where light met dark, children's laughter flared, soft as flour dust on a fresh loaf. Margaret closed the door gently, her hand brushing the new latch. In that moment she knew she would keep this paper for a long time, as she once kept a crumb of bread. But unlike the bread, which was for holding on, this paper was for walking forward. And when she withdrew her hand from the latch, the house breathed a long, warm sigh, as if to say that tonight, and perhaps many nights to come, the wind would remain outside. Late in the season, the wind moved across the porch, where 6 shadows now sat quietly around the wooden table. No one lowered their gaze anymore. Hands that had once been cold now rested on one another as if they had never known separation. Out here in the wide West, sometimes a home doesn't begin with timber, but with the way someone lets you sit down and eat until you're full. If this story reminds you of a time when someone quietly stayed by your side, leave just a single dot, so someone else might see it and know that kindness has never disappeared.